Hey everyone, it is Ed Gutowski, and what I wanted to do was I wanted to create a video in which I talked about the first part of our class, which is rhetoric and argument, because English 1A is a class that focuses on rhetoric and argument. So the first thing we have to do is we have to talk about rhetoric, because rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we talk about an argument, I'll talk about rhetoric. So, and that's kind of where we're going to spend the first couple weeks of class. So if I was in a ground class, what I would do something is that I did right over here is I would write on the board rhetoric and argument. I notice here it looks like it's backwards, so I'm sorry about that. But I'd write the word rhetoric on the board, and I would say, okay, students, since we know rhetoric and argument are linked, and we're going to talk about rhetoric, I want you to define the term rhetoric. And you should see the look on students' faces. Some students panic. Some people start crying. And then there are some students who they say, I've never ever heard the term rhetoric. So if this falls into sort of any position where you are right now, you're in the right spot, right? Because it's oftentimes I have students who say they never heard rhetoric, never heard rhetoric, they don't know how to define it. And so that's why we're going to spend a couple weeks trying to define the term rhetoric. But it's interesting because if I take a ground class, right, there are some of the students who've never heard the term rhetoric, but there are some students who they've heard the term rhetoric, but they don't know what it means. So what I do is then I break up rhetoric into kind of three categories. The first thing I say is, okay, look, we don't really know what rhetoric means, but let's first ask a couple questions. Is it safe that I could make the case that there are people who use rhetoric? And just about everyone will say yes. So I said, before we define rhetoric, let's figure out who are the people who use rhetoric. And we'll make a list on the board. And what's really interesting is I'll ask class, I'll say, okay, who uses rhetoric? And instantaneously, any single class I get, whether it's a ground class, an online class, whatever class it is, students can always say politicians. Politicians always use rhetoric. They are always associated with rhetoric. And if you think about it, it's 2024, and we're just on the dawn of getting into the nasty election season. And you may have heard in the last couple of months, Donald Trump is using rhetoric. Okay, I have no idea what that means. I heard it went one ear out the other. You may have heard Joe Biden has been using rhetoric. Okay, so we know that politicians use rhetoric. It's interesting, in every single class, the second group that always comes up is lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. Now, that would make sense because if we assume that, since we know rhetoric and argument are linked, what do lawyers do? They make arguments in a case of law. So we can safely assume, okay, we know some people who use rhetoric. Who are they? Politicians, lawyers. And then we can get, sometimes students will say, hey, philosophers use rhetoric, right? If I were to take a philosophy class, I might have heard Socrates or Plato are using rhetoric, right? Sometimes students will say things like writers will use rhetoric, right? So if we just stop right there and we say, okay, here we are, we've talked about the people who use rhetoric. Politicians, lawyers, writers, authors, philosophers. So we know there are people who use rhetoric. Then I switch to the second question. I said, let's talk about forms of rhetoric, so we have an idea of what a form of rhetoric is. So I always use an example in a ground class. I say, hey, look, I'm going to have a guest speaker. So I want you to imagine that I'm going to have a guest speaker, and right next to me, behind me, is going to pop out. Are you ready for this? I say, former President Barack Obama. Former President Barack is going to come in right now. He's going to come in behind me, and we know he's going to use rhetoric. Obama was a politician. We know he used rhetoric. I always like to pretend, hey, I'm going to be fair and balanced. I'll be like Fox News, so I'll bring in Sarah Palin. So Sarah Palin and Barack Obama are both behind me. They're using rhetoric. What are they doing? And students will say, well, okay, what are they doing? They're giving a speech. So a form of rhetoric can be a speech. And then I'll ask questions, well, how many people have seen former President Obama speak? And this day, most students say no, but, years ago I could ask students that question. I had students who served in the military. They would have heard Obama speak. Well, I'll say, well, how is it possible that you had seen Obama speak, but not live in person. And students will say TV. So then I'll say, hey, TV is a form of rhetoric. What else might be a form of rhetoric? We know a speech might be, TV. Well, then movies and films can be a form of rhetoric. And then if we go back to our list and we say, hey, writers might use rhetoric, well, then a form of rhetoric could be a book, a newspaper, a magazine, right? And then students really get into the discussion. They'll be like, well, hey, the internet is a form of rhetoric. Well, the internet is the greatest form of rhetoric of all time. So notice all I've done here is I've said, hey, we know there are people who use rhetoric. Politicians, lawyers, philosophers, writers. We know there are forms of rhetoric, say a speech, a movie, TV, books, magazines, and the internet. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is simple. I define rhetoric as words that are used to mislead, to deceive, and to con people. So my definition of rhetoric in the next couple of weeks is going to be words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. And what I want to do is just let that settle, right? Because in this 5-minute lecture, there's kind of a lot of things to kind of cover. And I just want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about what I've presented as rhetoric, right? We've defined rhetoric. We know there are people who use rhetoric, and we know there are forms of rhetoric. And what you're going to have is there's 2 other videos underneath my video that can give you a little more explanation on rhetoric, and then you have a discussion board on rhetoric where you get to define rhetoric, and you can agree or disagree with my definition. But as of week 1, I'm going to maintain my definition of rhetoric, and my definition of rhetoric as of week 1 is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and con people. So I'm excited to see what you think of rhetoric after watching this video, the other 2 videos, and then I'll read over your discussion board questions, and let's have some fun as we kind of examine rhetoric and argument.